Hello and welcome to Cowgirlblues Wednesday morning Zoom classes with Jane Renton. Today we are going to be looking at brioche.
Today we're going to look at the brioche, and even though brioche is knitting, it has a terminology all of its own. And more than anything, I think it's that terminology that creates confusion and makes it difficult to understand. So the way I like to look at it is to break it down into easier terms that we all know and understand and follow in our everyday knitting. So two of the terms that I'm going to look at to start off with is the slip one yarn over. In usual knitting, that abbreviation means we slip one and we create a yarn over. But in brioche, particularly when you're going to be knitting, the term is actually, you've got to bring your yarn forward, then you slip one, and then you take your yarn over. And I'll show you that in a minute. The BRK, it's a brioche knit. That's what the BRK stands for. And the reason it's a brioche knit is because this process creates two loops over one. So the way I like to look at it is a knit two together. So if we go from there and have a look, if we look here I have the two loops over one stitch that the yarn forward slip one yarn over creates. And here is my slip stitch. So when you're doing plain brioche, it's really simple. You bring your yarn forward, you slip one, and you knit two together. And that's all there is to it. Yarn forward, slip one, knit two together. Yarn forward, slip one, knit two together. Or, in brioche terminology, slip one yarn over and brioche knit. Here's our slip one yarn over, and the brioche knit, here you can see I've got my yarn over from the previous row and my slipped stitch from the previous row, and I knit those two loops together. And it's all about the terminology and understanding how the terminology works. And when it's a BRP, then it's a brioche purl. And again, the brioche purl is purling the two stitches together. Though they're not really stitches, it's more a loop. So if I go back there, here's your yarn over from the previous row, here's your slip stitch from the previous row, and you're going to put those two together into a knit stitch. Is that making sense for everyone? Lynn, I think you were working on a project using brioche.
Yes, I was attempting to. I got about so far, but it was in the round, and I kept making a mistake when I started the new row, and my stitches went all funny then. So I must admit I did pull it out, but the way you've explained this makes a lot more sense than what I was attempting to do.
I can. It is really easy as well in that if you drop a stitch, so if I were to drop a stitch, and you can see I've got my stitch and I've got the loop.
Yes.
So all I would need to do is pick up that stitch, make sure my yarn over happens on that one, and knit the two together. Whoops, let me get that back. Except I've done it back to front, sorry. Because you've got your two loops, and you can see on every one of those stitches all the way down there's the two loops. So if you drop a stitch, all you need to remember is that you've got to be picking up two loops and not just one.
Okay, so when you started that, did you start off with a few straight rows of ribbing?
I did.
Okay, just so that you've got something to hold on to before you start the brioche.
Yeah, the brioche, because it's so stretchy, if you don't start with ribbing, it very quickly distorts and goes out of shape.
So I think that was what some of my problem was as well. I was attempting to start with brioche from the foundation row, which I just couldn't get it right. So maybe I should attempt a few rows of straight ribbing before introducing the brioche.
Yeah, you can. So what happens is when you've got your brioche, at least your ribbing,
Yes.
and you're starting from your ribbing into your brioche, when you get to your purl stitch, before each purl stitch, you bring your yarn forward, slip your purl stitch, and then in your very first row, you won't have that loop. So you would just knit one. So then you create your brioche stitch. In the next row, you've got your brioche stitch to knit.
Okay.
So the foundation row would be a knit one, not a knit two together, not the BRK.
Okay. Okay. All right.
So it's when I do the next row, the stitch is exactly the same. I slip what looks like the purl stitch and knit the next two.
Okay.
So it's the same stitch back and front. There's no difference at all between the back and front of the work, which also means that it's a really nice reversible item, and which is why even when you're working with two colors, the project is completely reversible. The only thing is if you do a two-color rib to start off with, because of the way a two-color rib works, it won't be reversible.
Okay.
But if you were to do a single color rib and then work with two colors in your brioche, then it is completely reversible. But this way, like this, in a single color, it's so easy to actually end up not knowing which is the right side and which is the wrong side. The only way that I can tell is where my tail is.
Okay.
And that, for me, decides whether I'm working on the right side or the wrong side. So I'll get to the end of the row. And here I'm knitting in a double knit. So it feels even more textured and stretchy and soft and cuddly. And I think it would make a really, really nice winter jersey, because you've got that extra thickness. You can't really see it in the camera, but it's just so squishy and lovely.
It looks thick just there, from where you started it, you can see the difference.
Yeah, you can see this difference between the rib and the stitch. So here I'm on the next row, and again I do exactly the same thing. Yarn forward, slip the stitch, yarn over, knit two together. So when you're doing a single color, it's so easy, because that's all there is to it. But I find it makes such a difference to consider it in terms of the knitting terminology that we know already.
Yeah.
This can confuse. And for some reason, the abbreviations I've looked up on the explanation of these stitches, and this one is explained well enough, but then as soon as you get that one, people have all sorts of different ways of looking at it. But for me, if you look at it as a knit two together, it makes it much easier. So are there any other questions?
No, not on that one. Just if you can just tell me again what you do on that first row after you've done your few rows of ribbing.
So on the first row of ribbing,
No, the normal. Say I've got 4 to 5 rows of
Yes.
ribbing.
So
So then
I
you start
meant
with
your setup row, the
yes,
setup row.
get up row.
Okay. So what you would do is when you've got your purl stitch, before the purl stitch, you bring your yarn forward.
Yes,
Slip your purl stitch.
yes. And then just
And
knit
then
the
you
next
would
one.
and knit the knit stitch.
Okay.
And then you've got your
Get up row,
brioche.
the yarn over.
Yeah, and then it's all set up for you to start the SL1YO and the BRK.
And the start of the row, is it always a slip on like you would normally slip on in normal knitting, or do you go straight into the slip on yarn over?
Different patterns work differently. I prefer a slip stitch rather than going straight into it.
Okay.
It's for me, it just gives a really nice neat edge, and you can see I've got, and you would have heard me often talk about having a neat edge to work with.
Yes.
And here again, I've got my slip stitch, which gives me a nice neat edge.
So for your foundation row, your setup row, you would slip one and then bring the yarn forward and continue.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So when I started my rib, my first stitch was a slip stitch and then purl one, knit one.
Okay.
So I don't have a slip stitch, knit one, purl one. It's a slip stitch, purl one, knit one.
Okay.
And then at the end, when I get to the end, it's a knit one, purl one.
Okay. All right.
So I end with a purl and start with a, well, essentially it would be a knit stitch, but
That makes sense.
yeah. So that's all there is to brioche, to the brioche knit. Really, really simple. Any questions?
And the brioche purl, you only use that when you introduce the second color, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And then when you introduce the second color, every row is knitted twice.
Yes.
So you need to work with double pointed needles, because once you finish the row, you push the work to the beginning of the needle again, and then
Come back in the other color.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jane, after all this talk about how complicated brioche is and we can't possibly learn it in one easy move, you've now made it look ridiculously easy.
Yes.
And I don't know about everybody else, but what are you thinking? Do we want to tell Jane she's got to pick up another color and give us the little next step on what happens if you introduce another color?
Well, at least then we'd have everything on one video, wouldn't we?
Exactly. You can treat your circulars as double pointed and slide the stitches.
Yes, I can. Okay, so I'm going to get to the end of the row and then grab another color from my wonderful basket. And so this row has been a brioche knit row. And we're now then going to look at the BRP, which is a brioche purl. And essentially that is then a purl two together. Okay, so when you're working with the purl, your yarn forward doesn't need to happen because your yarn is already in front. So I'm working with is there enough contrast? No. I need a good contrast to be able to show you. Is that enough contrast? Yes. Okay, so now I've got to push my work back to the beginning. And I'll introduce the second color. Okay, so now you can see my purl stitch is now the stitch that's got the 2 loops.
Mm.
Okay, because I've pushed it back to the beginning. So I'm going to be starting with a slip one, and my very first stitch I've got to bring my yarn forward. But because my purl stitch is the one with 2 loops, that's what I'm going to purl. Okay, and I then need to do a yarn over with this slip stitch. So I keep my yarn in front, and I'm not going to be knitting it or purling it. I'm slipping the knit stitch, but I need my yarn over. So I take my yarn around the needle and bring it back to the front.
Do you always slip the stitch purl-wise?
Yes.
Okay.
I do, and the reason is I like my stitches flat. I don't want twisted stitches. So now I'm going to purl those 2 together, or brioche knit. My yarn is already in front, and I'm doing the purl stitch. So my knit stitch, I slip, bring my yarn over, and purl the next 2 together. Okay, my yarn's already in front. I need to slip the knit stitch and do the yarn over so that I can then purl the next 2 together. So actually it is really simple. It's the terminology that tends to confuse. And the fact that I think that you've got to knit every row twice. Sorry, my yarn over, I forgot.
I think this will be my favorite go-to video to watch.
Okay, so it really, really is.
I have to do my homework this afternoon.
Okay, so it's really easy. Let me get to the end of the row, and then I'll show you how we carry on going from here. Because often when you put your work down when you've done brioche, you're not sure whether you're going to be doing a knit row or a purl row, and what color you're going to be working with. So
before you purl, you have, yeah, I was going to say you haven't done your wool around.
yeah, my yarn over. No, that was right. And once you get going as well, it goes really quickly.
You get into a rhythm.
You do, very much so. Okay, so now I'm at the end of the row, and I've got 2 colors here, and which is the one that I'm needing to work with? Okay.
I would say pinky color.
So yes, you're right. And how you know is there's that color underneath. Okay. And what stitch am I going to be doing next?
Jane, can you bring it a little closer to the camera?
Okay.
Yes.
So can you tell what stitch I'm going to be doing next? Am I going to be doing the purl or the knit?
Should your is this your tail end is this side? So is this now your right side?
I've turned my work over. I've turned my work over, and now I need to be doing either a brioche knit or a brioche purl. So what tells me what stitch I need to be doing is where the yarn over is over the stitch underneath. Okay, so here on my knit stitch, I've just got a single stitch. I don't have a yarn over. So I know that I'm not going to be knitting. it's going to be a pearl. Can you see that?
Yeah. Okay, so if I'm looking at this now, where you had the knit stitch in the terracotta color,
Yeah.
you're now going to have the knit stitch in the blue because you've introduced the new colors. Is that correct? On this
Yes.
side.
Yeah, it gets a bit it's a bit confusing where because I've just picked up a stitch. He's just picked up a yarn. So we got to work a bit further and then you can see. But yeah, so there's the back. Can you see where I turned it over?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to be doing a slip stitch and bring the yarn forward, and I'm going to purl. Whoops, not the yarn over yet, and yarn over. And whichever stitch has the loop is the stitch that I need to be working with. The stitch that has no loop is the stitch that I'm going to be slipping. Is it making sense?
It is, yes. Well, for me, it is. Only because I've attempted it, I don't know how many times.
But also I found sitting, working with it and working out how does this actually relate to normal knitting abbreviations that we understand. For me, it then made it easier in knowing what to do and what to look for and how to know what stitch came next and what color came next. Because for me, when I first started, it was confusing. If I put the work down, I'd pick it up and say, well, where was I? Was I doing a knit stitch or a purl stitch? And which was the stitch that I needed to slip and which did I need to knit?
So now that's if you put it down and you pick it up, you're not sure where you are. You look at which way your yarn over stitch goes.
Yes.
Slant of that as to which color you're going to be working in.
Yes. So now I'll go back to the beginning.
Yes.
I slipped my work all the way back to the beginning. And now if we look at it, can you see which stitch has the yarn over?
The purl.
This stitch has the yarn over.
So it's got, you always yarn over from the right side. Okay.
Yes. Okay, so if we look at this stitch,
there's no yarn over
that stitch, it doesn't have a yarn over
in front. Okay.
So we know it has to be slipped.
Okay.
This stitch has the yarn over it, so we know we need to knit those two loops together. But to decide if we need to knit them or purl them, we look at what we've done before. So that's a knit. So now we're going to do the brioche knit. So I slip, bring my yarn forward, and knit the two together.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I slip the stitch that doesn't have the two together, the yarn over, and knit the yarn over together. And there I'm creating my two color brioche. So can you see how it's forming?
Yes.
And then on the other side, you can see the terracotta is staying as the knit stitch with the blue in the background.
That's making sense. Well, it's making sense to me now.
Good, good. So Bridget will put the video up, and then you'll be able to watch it and again until you get the idea that you've always got to have a yarn over, and the yarn over will be determining whether you're doing the BRK or the BRP, and the stitches below will be letting you know whether it's the K or the P.
And Jane,
Okay.
the stitch underneath the yarn over will tell you which color you should be working with.
Yes. Yeah. So when I do my next row, when I turn this over and do the next row, the color underneath the yarn over is the color that I need to do the next row with.
Okay.
When you were doing it just now, why did you not just turn the knitting round? You pushed it to the other end of the needle.
So that I didn't need to knit the terracotta again.
Oh, I see.
I was introducing the second color. So you can see here, every row is knitted twice. So here's my yarn from the terracotta row, and I'm now knitting the blue until I get there. When both yarns are on this side, then I turn my work around.
Oh, okay.
Until then, I push my yarn back to the beginning of the needle.
So you can't do this on a circular needle?
You can.
Oh.
You can't do it on straight needles.
You can't do it on
straight needles, yeah.
But you can also knit this in the round.
Okay, yeah. So how do people knit this on straight needles, or couldn't you?
You can't.
Oh, okay.
You've got to have double pointed needles or a circular needle.
Oh, okay.
So, but you can knit it flat, as I'm doing it here, or in the round, but it has to be needles where you've got needles at both ends, or points at both ends.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
It's so effective with the two colors.
It is. It's very effective. And then once you start doing patterns with the brioche, it's very effective.
Jane, are the brioche patterns next week's class?
If that's what you would like. That's pushing me.
Yeah, I think I'm just teasing you.
Thank you.
I didn't notice a strong response for yes, patterns next week from you.
Maybe we all need to prove with a swatch that we could do the two color one before we start the patterns.
Good idea.
Yeah, homework.
Yes.
Well, I'm thinking that a sort of a slouchy beanie or a neck warmer would be a really nice way to practice with just a little edge, a little rib edge, and then go into the brioche. So yeah, I'll see if I can pull something together for that.
Great. So then if we look at this, because I've now turned my work around because I've got both yarns on the same side, can you see which stitch I need to be doing? Am I going to be doing the knit or the purl?
Pearl.
Knit.
Yes, a knit, because here's my purl stitch all on its own, and my yarn over is going over the knit stitch. So it's a brioche knit. And then in what color do I need to be doing this first row?
The terracotta.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you'll be able to put your work down and come back to it, and you'll know exactly where you are and what color you're working with.
Never put it down.
If you did you put it down? Make a note of what you got to do on the next row.
Andrea Murray does have some lovely patterns, and she's just put out a new shawl as well. I'm not sure what it's called, where she mixes brioche with some other stitches as well. So I think if you look at her blog, she'll give you the latest, you'll be able to see what the latest shawl pattern is, and then you can find it on Ravelry. It's a really lovely looking shawl, and she's added some bobble stitches and all sorts to it. It's lovely.
I think I will be brave enough to do a beanie or a straight scarf to start off with until I get the hang of it. It's not like a cable stitch, which I know, and I'm not scared of this. I need to practice.
If you can knit, you can do a brioche. The only thing is to remember the terminology.
And I think I confused myself by looking at so many different videos, and everyone was explaining it differently as well.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is nice and simple. Thank you very much.
A pleasure. I do try and keep it simple. Okay, so you can see I'm carrying on here, and the terracotta stays as the main stitch on this row. On this side, should I say, and on the wrong side, there's the blue.
It's staying with this stitch. No, that looks really lovely.
Okay. So I do enjoy playing with brioche. And if you can knit, you can do it. It's just remember the terminology. You slip one with the yarn forward, yarn over, knit two together. That's all there is to it. Okay.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Thanks, Jane.
Pleasure. Any other questions?
Yeah, just show us when you do a purl row.
Okay, I'll get to the end of this row. I'm nearly there. Okay, so I've got one yarn on this side and one yarn on that side. So I know I've got to push my work all the way back to the beginning. And if I look at my work, which is the stitch that's going to be slipped? The knit stitch or the purl stitch?
The knit stitch.
That's right. So I'm going to be doing a brioche purl. Okay, and the color I'm using is?
Terracotta.
Blue.
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 So and I've got my yarn over the purl stitch already, so I'll straight away start with the purl. I'm going to be slipping the knit stitch. I'll bring my work yarn with the yarn over back to the front, purl those two together. Slip the stitch, yarn over, purl the two together. It's really very simple, actually. And I hope I'm making it look really simple so that you agree with me. No comments.
Jane, I think that you're making it look very straightforward, that there's a system and a language of brioche, and you have to be able to understand the pattern language, and then you have to be able to read the knitting.
Absolutely, which is why I break it down this way.
Yeah.
To me, it just makes so much more sense, so that when I'm working with a pattern, then I can interpret it in my method, and then any pattern is really, really quite simple because it just follows the same process. Now I'm nearly at the end of the row. And then we can look at it again. Sorry, my threads are really all loose. So here's the blue side. And there's the terracotta side. So I've got both my yarns on one side, and I need to decide what color am I working with and what stitch am I working with. So if I were going to do the next row, what would be my stitch, a knit or a purl?
Just done a purl, so shouldn't it be a knit?
Knit.
Knit. Knit and terracotta.
Which is the stitch? Yes, Gail, you're right, it is in terracotta. And which is the stitch that does not have a yarn over it? The knit stitch or the purl stitch?
The knit.
The knit.
Knit.
Okay, so if the knit stitch has no yarn over on it, then that's the slip stitch. So this is going to be a knit or a purl.
Purl.
Purl, yes. Because if I look at that stitch, it's my knit stitch, but I've got to slip it. So then this stitch has the yarn over on it, and it's a purl stitch. So this row would be in terracotta and the brioche purl. Okay. So then you can put it down and walk away from it, and you know what color you're going to be doing. And you know what stitch you're going to be doing when you pick it up again. And that's all there is to brioche. Knit and purl.
I like how you are teaching us that we need to practice in knowing what we're stitching. You know, you don't just follow a recipe, you know what you're knitting, you know what they look like.
Yeah. So it's the construction of the pattern which is important. If you just follow a pattern without knowing what you're doing, then when you put your knitting down and you come back, to try and work out where you were can be really difficult. But if you understand the construction, you can pick it up again and follow exactly where you were before.
Yes.
So Jane,
I'm just slightly confused. Do you have to push the knitting to the end of the needle on every row?
On every alternate row.
Alternate row, yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah, I've got to knit the terracotta next. Once I've knitted with the terracotta, I'm going to have the terracotta at the other end of my work.
Yeah.
So I have to push my work back to the beginning to work with the blue.
Okay, yeah. So you do that every second row?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So every row is knitted twice.
Yes. So you have to go back and knit this with the other color, knit the row again. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Jane, it seems like one thing that would be helpful as we're learning is never put the knitting down when the tails are at opposite ends?
That would help. What you can do is use a stitch marker. There's a stitch marker that looks like a little safety pin or something at the end that you need to be working at next.
Okay.
So then you can just put it down when you've got your yarn at the other end, put your stitch marker into where you need to be working next, and when I pick it up, take the stitch marker out, and then that's where you're going to be working from.
Okay. And then Vina also asked, if the tails are on opposite sides, does that help you identify whether you need to purl or knit in the next row and from which side?
So when your tails are on opposite sides,
so if you've got the blue on the one side and the terracotta on the right, if the blue is on your left, is that a purl row? And if the terracotta is on your left, is that a knit row?
You can't tell from which side your yarn is on. You need to tell from the stitch that's in front of you.
From your tails. So your tails, you can't tell.
You can't tell from the tails. You need to have a look at
the slip stitch.
Yes.
I get it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So that's the identifying factor of whether you're knitting or purling.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you.
And then the big loop is the color that you're going to use. The slip.
The slip knit. The slip stitch.
The blue there in the front shows you that you're going to use blue.
No, the color that's underneath the yarn.
Underneath. Okay, that's the color. Okay.
Yes. So I've got less of it on this row. I've got less of the terracotta than the blue. So I need to bring the terracotta to the top again.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe next week we can just bring along our knitting and correct all the mistakes we've made.
We can do that.
Because I can do the one color, but I haven't introduced another color.
Okay.
So really the technique in how you knit, it is quite simple in, there's a system and you do the system.
Yes.
But the real understanding of brioche is understanding your construction.
Yes. So you had asked if I've got yarn on both sides, how do I know what color I'm going to be working with next, and whether I've just worked with the terracotta or the blue. So here's my work with terracotta yarn on one side and the blue on the other. So if I look at this, can you see what color I'm going to be working with next?
Blue,
absolutely. And is it going to be a brioche knit or a brioche purl?
Purl.
A knit.
A knit. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a knit stitch in the blue. So I can put my work down with my yarns on either side, because I know when I pick it up, I've got to work with the blue. So I've got to push my needles all the way through to the beginning to be able to pick up the blue thread. But it is easier if you just put a stitch marker when you've finished and you know where you've got to start again. Yeah. So you've always got to look at how did I do the stitches before, what rows did I, at least what color did I work on before, and I can see what color next, because what do I have least of on my needle?
Blue.
Yeah, so I know I've got to work with the blue. Okay.
Thanks, Jane. That's been really helpful.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Explained very nicely and simply. Thank you.
A pleasure. There's the terracotta side and the blue side. There's still no wrong side or right side.
And it is just such a beautiful way to knit with two colors to get that reversible contrast.
It is, very much so.
Thanks, Jane, and thank you all for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next week.